60 years ago in June. Munich is, as it is in France, as it is in the United States, as it is in many, many other countries, a synonym for giving in. Appeasement has not been a dirty word in the early 1930s. As a matter of fact, appeasement was regarded as a legitimate tool of diplomacy. It became a non-word after Munich. And Munich showed us that appeasement is not possible if one of your partners, or better said, one of the powers you are confronting, is not believing in agreements, in the written word, in international conferences. This was exactly the position of Hitler. If we look back, and I think we have ample opportunity to look back on the historical facts on Sunday, you will find that both France and Britain were trying very hard to save the peace. The British Prime Minister actually came to see Hitler twice, or even 3 times, twice in Bonn, once in Berchtesgaden, to try to find a way out of this crisis. A very unusual step for a British Prime Minister. I think that he deeply believed that even in these days of crisis in the summer of 1938, it would be possible to save peace. This is how he came back from Munich, calling it peace for our times, not in our times, for our times. He had signed a separate agreement with Hitler, a bilateral agreement, because he thought that there might be a chance to give peace a chance again. He was wrong. So one of the lessons learned is, indeed, never give in. If you are confronted with someone who is ruthless, who is not acting within the framework of international diplomacy, there's only one way out. Strength. And this may lead to the use of force. As you have eloquently pointed out to us, the major difficulty in Europe was that most Europeans vividly remembered World War I, and they did not believe that anyone would be prepared to use force again after this nightmare of 4 years, which was called a civil European war. What they did not realize was that with Hitler, no agreement was possible. So one of the lessons learned, and I think the most important lesson learned, is diplomacy has its days, the use of force has its days. Thank you very much.
Now, my deep pleasure to introduce to you somebody who's played a very important role, an inspiring role in this series of events, the Consul General of the Czech Republic, Daniel Kummerman.
It's a strange role, because after 2 perpetrators, I should speak as a victim. So, in a way, I must say I sort of lived it in personal life as well, because I was told by my father about the time when he was mobilized and he was with his unit somewhere close to Czech-German borders, and how disappointed and frustrated they were when they had to return back. And as a result of that, he actually lost practically all his family in the war. So I would say I have a very personal feeling towards the fact of appeasement and the results of it. But I would say rather another thing, which was already mentioned here, that this appeasement also had its history, and it has its results, which are sometimes forgotten. One was that actually, as is mentioned here, that too many people believed that somehow the history changed after the First World War. And if we remember, sometimes we are in the same situation today. The famous author of End of History actually recalled his views, but still, when we started traveling to the West after 1990, we found out surprisingly so many people there who somehow believed that the world has changed considerably, dramatically, and that the history cannot be repeated. And the other thing which is not mentioned very much is that actually Munich also led to the rise of communist regime, which means we were the victims of the first wave of appeasement, and then of the secondary result, which was a communist regime. And I must say I was very pleased by my colleagues who spoke here before me, because both of them represent what I might call the healthy views in Europe, because when we joined in EU after in 2005, we sometimes saw our role as those who should remind Europe of dangers that can be a result of feeling too safe and of believing that something deeply changed in the world. So I'm glad that I hear this message of those who understand these dangers, and so I hope that we won't be needed as those who warn as much as we were before. Thank you.
You'll notice that my accent is not an American accent, and it's actually an accent that is very familiar to our real guest of honor today, because I'm an Australian, Australian-born. I actually was a schoolboy when John Howard became prominent in Australian politics, and his influence on the Australian political scene has been absolutely extraordinary. He is the second longest serving Prime Minister in Australia's history, a deep friend of the United States, a supporter of the State of Israel, but more importantly, a supporter of Western civilized values and standing up for Western civilized values. And his firm and assertive leadership on these issues has really transformed an Australian leader into a world leader. And Australia is a very long way from here, but his voice has been heard, and heard very, very clearly and very, very loudly by many, many people around the world. So it's my deepest pleasure to introduce my former Prime Minister, John Howard.
Thank you very much, Avi, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Munich has become the greatest historical symbol of the failure of a policy of appeasement. We all understand that, and endeavouring to understand the significance of this commemoration and to recall that the Munich Agreement represented the high watermark of the 1930s policy of appeasement. It's very important to understand the mood of the time, because the mood of the time when Munich was consummated is in fact the message for our time. It's already been indicated that appeasement was a popular policy. Sadly, it was. And in 1938, when Chamberlain came back from Munich and he infamously waved that piece of paper in the air, he quoted Shakespeare. He quoted Hotspur from Henry IV, Part 1, when he said, "Out of this nettle danger, we pluck this flower safety." And the mood at the time was one of jubilation. And it was understandable. Why? Because millions of people had died in the trenches of World War I on both sides. I mean, France lost 1.5 million men, Germany more. My own country, with a male population of only 2.5 million, had lost 60,000. And the losses on the British side and Britain were enormous. So you could understand why people had this attitude. And that made all the more remarkable the prescience of people like Winston Churchill, who warned and understood from the very moment that Hitler gained power in 1933 what a threat he represented. And the resonance today of all of that is that it is inevitable that populations over a period of time will tire of arguments that say you have to deal with difficult situations by saying no. We're seeing it today in America, in Australia, in Britain, in many parts of the world. People are starting to say, well, maybe this war against terrorism has been exaggerated. Maybe it's not a problem after all. Maybe the threat has passed. It's now been pleasingly, happily, it's now been more than just on 7 years since the terrorist attack in New York and Washington, and people understandably will think that the threat has passed. I hope it has, we all do. But we'd be unwise to imagine that terrorism is something, given its roots in Islamic fascism, it would be unwise of us to imagine that it's not something that will be with us for a very long period of time. And trying to encourage populations to maintain resistance to terrorism and to put up with the inconvenience of laws, and to hear, understandably, the civil libertarian saying the laws go too far, it's a very, very difficult thing. And the real message of Munich for today's generation, the real lesson of Munich from today's generation is, of course, as the German consul said, a policy of never giving in is the right policy. But the other great message for today's generation is that you have to persevere in dealing with manifestations of evil. They don't go away of their own accord. All of my understanding of the modern terrorist threat is that the terrorists will play a long game. They will wait for years. And terrorist attacks are years in the planning. And we have to maintain a vigilance. We have to cooperate. We have to persevere, as President Bush courageously did in Iraq. It's interesting that the wife of the Iraqi president is here today. We ought to remind ourselves that the beginning of last year, when President Bush announced the surge, he had virtually no support. He had a lot of criticism within military areas. There was very little worldwide diplomatic support, and he faced a lot of political criticism here in the United States. And yet here we are in September of 2008, and the outlook in Iraq is arguably better and brighter than the outlook in Afghanistan. I think indeed it almost certainly is. And whilst I don't want to foolishly say that the problem is behind us, there is now a greater prospect that the goal of a democratic Iraq sitting, I hope, coexisting peacefully and positively with the one true democracy in the Middle East, that's the State of Israel, that goal can be achieved. So it is a reminder that the message of Munich is a twofold message. You never surrender when your cause is right. That's the first and most obvious message, and a policy of appeasement does not ultimately buy peace when you're dealing with evil. But the other message is that in today's